Well, here we'll take a look at this light blue, and yes, that is the color description that Ford used for this particular color. 1972 LTD convertible. This was the last year that the LTD convertible was produced. It was sunset after the 1972 model year, and perhaps in part because the sales really just weren't that great on it. It only sold 4,234 units in 1972, and the previous year, where the LTD was refreshed to this kind of bird beak styling, the convertible only sold 5,750 units. So it was a rather thin seller, and I suspect that for that reason, and in part because Ford knew that upcoming rollover standards were likely coming, they thought that they would just cancel it outright, perhaps a bit early. But regardless, I think this 1972 LTD is a handsome convertible, and let's talk a little bit more about some of the interesting features around it. First is, as I mentioned, 1971 saw this new body style for the LTD introduced, and it went back to these open headlights, whereas the 1968 LTD was the first one to introduce hidden headlights, and that carried through the 1970 model year. But for 1971, the sheet metal was revised, and the hood got this kind of pointy edge to it, and the headlights became fixed. I still think that it's an overall handsome look, kind of masculine look at the front end. And one other thing that I find interesting is notice the form of the hood where it makes the grille. It's rather narrow. And in these years, there was kind of an interesting styling philosophy amongst the Ford Lincoln Mercury products. And that was, if you got a Ford, you got this rather narrow shape grille. The Mercury's got one that was a bit wider, and that shoulder on the hood would get pulled out so that that area that protruded was a bit bigger. And then the Lincoln had the biggest area on the hood that was protruding out. So I guess the size of that particular form on the hood, the bulge, depicted how much you spent on your vehicle, perhaps. Turning to the rear three-quarter view, you can see that you could easily identify a 1972 LTD versus a 1971 because the 1972 LTD lost the full-width tail lamp that the 1971 had and had this redesigned tail lamp format out back. The car in both 71 and 2 has this interesting lower body side trim, and this particular vehicle is equipped with a body side molding, which looks rather busy on the car, especially given the feature line that is just above it. Looks like it's almost a double feature line. This car is also equipped with one of the wheel covers that I love of Fords of this era. These are the turbine vane wheel discs that graced a number of Galaxies and LTDs in the late 60s. Until the 1972 model year. They are relatively hard to find now, and I do have a set, but if anybody has another set that they would like to sell, please be sure to contact me because I would love to have it. You can also see this convertible has a soft top. It's not a hard top, but it was a rather well-made convertible, and these drive quite well. The frame rigidity was strengthened for the convertibles, and there's, for the time period at least, relatively minimal cowl shake. On the inside, these LTD convertibles were equipped with vinyl trim like you see here, with all vinyl seating and vinyl door tops. You can see this car is equipped with power windows, and it does have air conditioning as well. It does not have a cruise wheel. You can tell that because there's no buttons on the steering wheel, and the horn honks by pushing the horn pad in the center and not pinching the rim like it did on the cruise wheel. The astute observer will also spot the little light on the passenger side dashboard area beneath the vents. That is the fasten belts light that if you put the car in gear and the belts are not buckled, either the driver's seat or the passenger seat, it's going to create an annoying sound. That was something that people hated, and in part because if you put a backpack or a bag of groceries or something with some weight on the passenger seat, you had to buckle in your groceries so that that buzzer wouldn't go off. You can also see that the IP for the 7172 LTD was unique, and it was different from the Mercury and the Lincoln. Here you can see what the Mercury IP looked like. They would go to a common IP, although with a different top pad in the 1973 model year. So this was just something that went on for a few short years. And here you can see a close-up of the instrument cluster. It's really nicely laid out with the warning lights beneath the speedometer, the clock on the right, the fuel gauge on the left. By the way, if you drive one of these Fords and your fuel gauge is stuck on E, chances are all you have is a sunk float. You can buy one on eBay for about $10. Really easy to take out. Don't even have to drop the fuel tank in the car. You just knock out the fuel tank sender ring and take out the fuel tank sender and replace the float. Just snaps in and out and you're done. You can see at the bottom left the HVAC control. That was common on the Ford and the Mercury, and the placement was the same. And you'll note beneath the HVAC control there are two switches. The leftmost one is for the fan speed, and the right one, it says accessory, but that operates the convertible top. I have no idea why Ford said accessory, but perhaps they just didn't want to print more parts. And if that were the rear window defogger or something on another car, accessory worked just fine. You can see this car also has an AM/FM stereo radio by looking off to the right. Here's a view of the back seat, and despite the fact that this is a full-size car, although it's not as large as the Mercury's or Lincoln's, the back seat really is not very big on these, and you can see that the seat back is pretty upright. And that was to make room for the convertible top storage. But despite, again, the fact that this is a full-size car, I wouldn't put anybody back here in the penalty box for that long of a period of time. Maybe some of the in-laws or something like that could fit back there for a brief period. Despite the back seat's relative lack of roominess, one thing that the Ford convertibles do have is quite good space here in the trunk. You can see the spare tire does take up a considerable amount of room, but this deep well trunk, facilitated by the fuel tank being placed vertically in that raised section area, it's just underneath there, allows for still a good amount of cargo space. And of course, some people would just take the spare tire out and have even more. But if you wanted to carry around that spare, in this case, this is, I believe, an original spare tire, you still have plenty of room to carry groceries or a golf bag or two or something. It's a very, very deep well trunk. This was characteristic of Ford for many years and was characteristic of them even on the last Panther platform vehicles, the Ford Crown Vics and Mercury Marquis and the Lincoln Town Car, that were produced all the way into the 2000s. They had a similar style trunk. GMs did have this on some vehicles. The 61 to 64 full-size cars had a setup like this, but after that, GM reverted to the more traditional trunk. Some people love this Ford trunk because of the deep well and the space. Some people hate it because of the high liftover, and you kind of have to stoop down to get your groceries or things to retrieve them. One last detail on the inside, and that is that the convertible top on the inside really wasn't finished. You can see the exposed roof bows, but it didn't really matter much. I did think it was pretty slick how they disguised the latching mechanisms on these. You have to lower the sun visors, and then the latching mechanism appears like it's part of the top of the windshield, but you pull it back and it moves a certain amount out of the way, and that's what releases the top. The top is full power after you release both latches, one on either side of the vehicle. And the other thing that you have to do is make sure that you zipper down the rear window so that you don't have an issue with the convertible top going down either. Last but not least, let's turn under hood, and you can see this particular vehicle is equipped with a 400 cubic inch 2 Venturi V8. And this was under the hood of many of these LTDs. In this particular form, it made 172 horsepower, and you could get either the 351 Cleveland under hood in these Fords that made 153 horsepower, this 400, which made 172, or the 429 cubic inch V8 with a 4 Venturi carburetor that made 208 horsepower. Doesn't sound like a lot of horsepower, but let me tell you, the torque ratings on these engines are pretty high. And so consequently, they drive around just fine. I mean, it drives like it has quite a bit of power. In fact, I believe the torque rating on the 400 is within 10 or 15 foot-pounds of the 429. So unless you're really stepping on it, the 400 feels very peppy. And I can tell you that driving Fords with 2 Venturi carburetors, they feel much peppier than the 4 Venturi carburetors. The 4 Venturi carburetors just seem to be jetted a bit leaner, and they don't have the throttle tip in that the 2 Venturis do. Now, the 400 and the 351 were pretty good engines. The 400 did have some lower-end oiling issues, and that's something to watch out for on higher mileage vehicles. And by higher mileage, I mean kind of approaching 100,000 miles. Unfortunately, that is one of the issues with this engine that is otherwise very, very reliable, particularly if the oil wasn't changed very frequently. The 429s and later the 460s don't have that same issue, although one thing you have to worry about there is because the 4 Venturi carburetors are so unreliable and flooded out so often, they often flooded out and gas dripped into the oil through the intake, and that diluted the oil mixture and caused it to lose its lubricating properties. So you got to be a little bit careful in some cases, but by and large, when you buy one of these cars with low mileage like this car was, so a 20,000 mile car that maybe I shouldn't have passed up. I looked at this car probably 3 years ago, and for whatever reason, I kind of passed on it. It had a few things that were wrong with it, but it was obviously a really nice vehicle, and I think the seller just wanted a little bit too much for what I thought it was worth, but somebody else bought it, so what do I know? In any event, hope you enjoyed this spotlight on this 1972 LTD convertible, the last of the LTD convertibles. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.